So we as Voces del Sur, from the beginning of the initiative, made an effort to align our monitoring and alerts with the UN SDG, and specifically in our case with indicator 16.10.1. Target 6, so SDG 16 is the one that is most relevant for I think most of our work. Target 16.10 is ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. There are two indicators under 16.10. 16.10.1 is the number of verified cases of killing, kidnapping, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and torture of journalists, associated media personnel, trade unionists, and human rights advocates in the previous 12 months. So that is a mouthful. But I think this is where kind of our secret sauce comes in. So first, what did it mean to align Voces del Sur monitoring with 16.10.1? The UN has an official definition of each term included in that indicator in a process akin to those of us that work on US government programs. There are F indicators that standardize how we report to US aid. It's a similar process to the UN. So there are definitions for each of those terms. We use that to align the monitoring from Voces del Sur. And the benefit of that is that then the alerts and the reports, such as the one that we're promoting here today, are able to feed directly into the UN monitoring system of that indicator. But again, I think the most interesting part is this high-level political forum, and this is the part where I think we've broken some ground in a way that is relevant for a lot of other actors working in the space. So each year, the UN reviews progress on 5 of the 17 SDGs, 4 plus SDG 17, which is about partnerships. So each SDG is reviewed once every 4 years in a process that's somewhat similar to the UPR process, but it's known as the high-level political forum. That is what has been going on of those indicators. In the case of 16.10.1, it's even more complicated because, as you heard, there's so many different stakeholders included there. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is designated as the custodian agency, but they have to coordinate with UNESCO, who is really responsible for the journalist and media freedom part, and with ILO, who's responsible for the trade unions part. So it's kind of a mess of a process, even more so for this indicator than for others. Each custodian, and so then to inform this high-level review of compliance of the indicators, there are 3 sources of information that the UN uses. The first is an annual report produced by the custodian agency. The second is voluntary national reviews, which, as the name suggests, are reports, voluntary reports submitted by national governments. This year, from talking to the UN, I understand that about 60% of member states submitted any kind of report. And since they're voluntary, it's at the discretion of each government what they choose to report on. So very few governments submit a comprehensive report with information on all 16 indicators. In the case of 16.10.1, I understand that 50-something countries actually submitted a voluntary report that addressed 16.10.1. So that's a huge gap, and you can imagine that probably the majority of the countries that chose to submit a report probably were trying to highlight favorable information. The third source of information are shadow reports. And again, I think probably everyone in this room is familiar with what a shadow report is. But what has been so important for us as Voces del Sur to learn about is, for the UPR, shadow reports are built into the process. There's a pre-session as part of the UPR held shortly before the official exam, where there's a space for civil society to present to the missions to the UN there. And it's, again, a pretty well understood process by this point. Depending on the country under review, the UN generally receives dozens or even hundreds of these shadow reports, which is good, but also makes it hard for any individual report to stand out. In the case of the SDGs, that is not 16.10.1, the UN received 2 shadow reports for Latin America. The Voces del Sur report, which you all have access to today, and then Transparency International submitted a broader report that addressed all of SDG 16 and included some token information about 16.10.1. So what that means is, I think there is a space and opportunity that civil society is not necessarily leveraging to take advantage of that. If you submit 1 report out of 600, it's hard to separate the wheat from the chaff. But when you're 2 reports, I think we have evidence in these past 2 weeks that the UN really paid attention to it. And I can't speak for the other regions to the same level, but my understanding is that it's a similar situation. So By submitting the report, by engaging UNESCO and the UN throughout this process, it's really given the Voces del Sur network a lot of opportunities. So again, one, informing this high-level political forum, which was through the reports, which officially the UN cannot directly cite a shadow report or civil society information in their official reports. They have to rely on official government data, but informal conversations with UN officials confirm that they actually do rely on civil society information to verify and inform their own reports. But even more than that, again, this is all a new process to review the SDGs. The high-level political forum that's finishing now is the last review of the first cycle of reviews. So now every SDG has been reviewed once, and the UN is still developing and perfecting the process. So what's interesting is, based on the results of our monitoring, of our reporting, of our engagement with the UN is actively requesting input from the Voces del Sur vote. Is that right now it really is just capturing killings, kidnappings, expanding that definition to include broader categories of danger and protections that are needed. But as we all know, that's a messy process, one that's difficult to measure. That's where the methodology of Voces del Sur and other partners can come in handy, and one where civil society, not only for 16.10.1, but for this whole process, has an opportunity to help the UN to deepen and improve their indicators. Just as one last example, 16.10, that target has 2 indicators. The other one is related to access to information. And there's a requirement for states, for each government to pass an access information law, which is pretty cut and dry, but also to implement that law. And it's the same process where the UN is actively looking for help in how to define what it means to implement an access to information law. So I'll end by saying that what our experience has shown is that in a way that doesn't exist at the UPR, perhaps at the Inter-American Commission, the review of the SDGs is still an evolving process, and one that the UN is hungry for engagement from civil society. That engagement can take a number of different forms. At its most basic level, they're looking for shadow reports and other sources of information, not just in the quadrennial official high-level review of any given indicator, but to inform the custodian agency's annual reports and also just any other information on an as-needed basis. 2, they're looking for help in refining the definition of certain indicators. One thing I failed to mention is each indicator is classified as a tier 1, 2, or 3 indicator, depending on how measurable and specific the indicator is. Tier 1 indicators are kind of the easiest ones. There's not a lot of those for SDG 16. The tier 3 indicators are ones that lack a rigorous definition, and when again, the UN, there are spaces and for civil society to engage. And then 3, as part of the high-level review itself, there are official side events within the UN. There are unofficial side events that can be held with UN agencies and with other stakeholders in New York that are really good opportunities for civil society. And last but not least, it's important to mention this whole process takes place in New York. So from a purely practical perspective, for those of us that are based in Washington or even in Latin America, it tends to be a lot easier and cost-effective to go to New York, a little bit more feasible than it is to go to Geneva. So it's something that can be done, not just during that high-level political review, but in between.
Thank you, Matt. I was remiss in not pointing out that the report is available in the entryway just outside the back door, the door at the back of the room. So, Adriana, please give us your take on how the methodology worked and how you were able to gather these indicators.
Okay. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I would briefly like to explain to the methodology of our work. I'm going to read my text because my English is very bad. I'm so sorry for that. The methodology applied was based on understanding local realities and identifying regional communities, while following the specific framework established by the SDG target 16.10.1. The first 5 common indicators were defined based on the SDG 1610.1 target. However, the group felt that additional indicators needed to be added to truly understand the situation of freedom of expression in the region, as murder, kidnapping, torture to journalists are extreme attacks and only tell a partial story on the situation of freedom of expression. Therefore, additional indicators needed to be included to provide a more detailed understanding of each country performance. The 8 organizations shared their local reality and local monitoring methodologies, and this information was farmed in the regional level. Each organization to continue implementing their local practice while reporting under shared common indicators at the regional level. This methodology has allowed to bring attention to more local cases that normally go to a regional and international stage. Additional indicators track, among other, stigmatization of journalists, administrative and justice process initiatives against journalists, laws that may restrict freedom of expression, and attacks on freedom of expression in the internet. Access to public information, and SDG 16.10.2 indicators are inclusive, participatory, transparent, and etc. A cross-screen indicator was included to identify when an attack occurred in response to the victim gender. The indicators were defined with support and guidance from UNESCO and were validated by Relatoría Especial de la OEA. We created a tool that allows comparative analysis of the state of press freedom and freedom of expression in the region. New forms of coordination and collaboration were established between civil society organizations in different countries. Focuses exclusively on journalists. The indicators often approach beyond the relevant cases that each of the 8 countries faces. And with the support of the network, law change. Consecutively, I would like to highlight the importance of this pioneer project in Latin America, outstanding for its monitoring methodology, but above all for the impact it has achieved. With the support of the network, laws changed in Bolivia. The attempts to promote censorship laws with stopped in Peru. The issues related to freedom of expression in Venezuela were made visible, and we have played a key role in the transition in Ecuador, etc. Additionally, the member organizations have managed to position themselves both locally and internationally, always under the umbrella of Voces del Sur. Our biggest challenge now is to have an effect of greater impact on government, but above all on society. If we manage to get people to care about freedom of expression, then it will be easier to stop the country's violations in this right. We believe that Voces del Sur work must continue by adding countries and bringing a light upon a problem that can only be fought and hopefully reserved and united from with citizen consensus across the region. Thank you. I'm sorry for my bad English.
Thank you for that, Adriana. Okay, Dagmar, now about the actual findings. Tell us what the report actually says at the country level and regionally comparing across the region.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Yeah? Yeah. Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Sima and Ned, for hosting this event. And thanks for the support of PADF, Fundamedios started Voces del Sur project in Ecuador. I will try to summarize the main findings of this report for 2018 that includes Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, Honduras, and Nicaragua. I'm glad that we have 5 out of the 8 countries in this room today, so you can ask them later all the inquiries you may have. But as a journalist, I cannot ignore the present and what has happened in other countries that are not being monitored by this coalition today. We are absolutely appalled by the attack to the animation studio in Kyoto today, where 33 persons were killed, 36 were injured. Violence against freedom of expression is rising. On the other hand, 6 journalists were assassinated in the Americas last month. In Brazil, Romário da Silva Barros, a local news reporter of Maricá municipality in the state of Rio de Janeiro, was shot in the head on June 18th. Robinson Giorno, the owner of a digital media outlet, was killed a few weeks earlier in the same municipality. Yes, it says it's on. You may give me the... Okay. There I go. You hear me now? No? Other? Freedom of expression is being harassed. Okay. Did you listen before? Yeah, okay. I just continue. But yes, we are absolutely appalled about all the rise in the aggressions against freedom of expression. And yes, in Brazil, there were 2 journalists killed last month. In Colombia, the reporter José Libardo Montenegro was assassinated on June 11th in the department of Nariño. Anderson Perez, a former FARC member who started working as a journalist as part of returning to the civil life, was killed in the department of Cauca on June 7th. Also on June 11th, a Mexican journalist, Norma Sarabia Garduza, was shot in the head. One day before, radio host Petion Rospit died during protests in Haiti. They were protests against corruption. The Americas are not a safe place to work, and being a journalist is one of the most dangerous professions you can exercise today. The countries where these professionals were assassinated last month are not war zones, nor are they the axis of evil, as usually Cuban-influenced countries are called, and where there is openly no freedom of expression or respect to fundamental rights. Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia are rule of law democracies and count with mechanisms to protect journalists. It's not enough to count the number of journalists murdered, kidnapped, tortured, or disappeared. It is essential to holding the governments accountable for their lack of capacity to ensure a safe environment for journalists to carry out their profession. We, as civil society, need to raise awareness of all these abuses and attacks that have been perpetrated by members of the state or the organized crime, or maybe a conjunction of both, the authorized crime. We are satisfied that UNESCO has recognized the value of this monitoring tool at its 12 common indicators to measure the country's progress towards SDG 16 regarding peace, justice, and strong institutions. In 2018, the patterns of extreme violence, impunity, and authoritarian policies towards journalists continued unabated. In the 8 countries, we registered a total of 732 alerts, being Nicaragua and Venezuela the countries with the highest numbers of violations. Let me just put this on the plate. Aggressions and attacks were the most recurring alerts, followed by cases related of abusive use of state power and access to information. In 55% of the total alerts, the state was the perpetrator. Regarding the worst forms of violations against freedom of the press and freedom of expressions, 2 journalists were tortured, 8 kidnapped, and 6 murdered. If we now go by countries, Nicaragua is by far the country with the highest number of violations of human rights. Journalists have been murdered, assaulted, criminalized, harassed, and have been victims of unlawful detentions. The press has suffered the destruction or seizure of equipment and the shutdown of entire media outlets. Miguel Mora and Lucia Pinda from 100% Noticias were finally released in May after being detained for almost 6 months on charges of terrorism. The confiscated news media equipment hasn't been returned yet. The number of journalists living in exile has risen from 75 at the end of 2018 to 90. Many of them try still to broadcast on digital media to Nicaragua. But not only censorship is a problem. Nicaragua is also one of the countries with the lowest access to internet. People get their news through radio or newspapers. La Prensa has been denied access to paper for 1 year, while almost all the radio stations are owned by the Ortega Murillo family business. Freedom of expression in Nicaragua is an emergency. In Venezuela, the method applied in Nicaragua is not new. Venezuela is the master of abuse of power and, of course, of suppressing printed media by imposing paper and ink shortages. From 90 newspapers, only 30 survive. Some of them have gone from a daily to a weekly circulation to stretch the paper they've got. The digital media news journalists are constantly harassed and intimidated. Sites are frequently blocked by state or by private internet providers. Courts have become an instrument of harassment, and at least 5 outlets face charges of libel. The photojournalist Jesus Medina was arbitrarily detained in August 2018 and is still detained. And there are 2 journalists who have house arrest, so they are not free. On the other hand, in Venezuela, there is a total blackout of public information. Key social and economic indicators have not been published for the last years. Bolivia. Persecution and intimidation of the press is institutionalized in Bolivia. The president calls us cartel of lies. Sounds familiar, probably, here in the region. Apart from the stigmatizing rhetoric, the few independent media outlets are absolutely asphyxiated through abusive practices and allocated the state advertisement. There are also 13 approved norms that restrict press freedom and facilitate censorship. But there is finally good news. After 8 years that the media owners opposed this measure, last week Evo Morales repealed the law that forced media advertise state campaigns for free, at least once. In Honduras, the hostility against the press has increased since the second term of Juan Orlando Hernández and his fraudulent election. The government did everything to silence coverage of the protest, where 30 people died. Persecution, harassment, surveillance, censorship, and self-censorship stifles quality journalism. 6 journalists were arbitrarily detained and their equipment confiscated. Honduras also became a country of secrets. The approved law of official secrets and declassification of public information exempts more than 20 public institutions from providing access to information of public interest. 3 journalists from El Comercio in Ecuador were kidnapped and assassinated in Colombia by a dissident armed group from FARC. Organized crime is a main concern in Ecuador. On the other hand, the new government is open to dialogue and willing to deaccelerate confrontation imposed by the former and restrictive administration of Rafael Correa. The communications superintendent were suppressed and the communication law reformed. But unfortunately, there are still many remaining authoritarian middle-level officials that still impose their intimidation and judicial persecution. Fundamedios Executive Director, César Ricaurte, faces an arrest warrant for publicly making a comment of a functionary of the Correa administration. In Peru, investigative journalists face charges of defamation and libel, as well as abuse of the state power and subpoenas to reveal the sources used by journalists to denounce corruption in the judicial system. On the other hand, extractive activities, drug trafficking, and illegal mining are growing in the provinces. journalists who investigate them are under constant threat. There are serious cases of intimidation, as far as setting on fire a car of a journalist who was investigating corruption in the municipality of Iberia. The assassination of a journalist in this region in 2016 remains unpunished. The loss of media job is the biggest threat to journalists in Argentina. Since 2015, over 3,000 jobs were lost, and an equal number is at risk today. Yes! There must be a heaven for journalists too. That's Uruguay. For the regional report, it is essential to count with best practices to compare with. Uruguay marks a milestone with the 10th anniversary of the law to access to public information. The report recommends, in all the cases, the need for a strong civil society that raises awareness and denounces the threats to journalists and their safety. As the violations of freedom of press does not only affect communicators, but all the citizens and their rights to be well informed and make decisions and live in democracy. The methodology for all this standardized report is completed, and we invite other organizations and countries to contribute with Voces del Sur, using this methodology, expanding the impact of the shadow report, and making civil society stronger on its demands from governments for justice and peace, which includes freedom of expression and the protection of journalists.
Thank you, Dagmar. Before I open it up for discussion from the floor, I have a couple of questions that I could kick off with for whoever wants to answer them. One is whether there's a sense of the governments who have signed on, as Matt said, every member of the United Nations has signed on to the SDGs, but on the ground, is there much actual buy-in by government officials, and can these indicators be used for advocacy to make them actually follow through? And then my second question is also about next steps, which is what other countries are you thinking of expanding Voces del Sur to? No? Better? Who might want to become part?
You want to take the first and I'll take the second?
Yeah, well, I think normally governments are not so open to accept reports from civil society, but it's they have once it's presented on as a shadow report at UN. It's more like more an official document that they need to acknowledge and work on it. This report is just being released. We have to see what's the reaction of the governments. But we really would encourage other countries to have also this kind of reports, because it's as more countries join this kind of reporting, it becomes stronger for civil society to demand this the respect for the human rights. And I think this is a good tool. I mean, this, Matt, I don't know if you.
I would just add that in regards to whether national governments are responsive to information from reports such as this, I think there's a sweet spot. I think there are those governments that are not responsive under hardly any circumstances to civil society advocacy such as that. Then there are good governments that have limited need to engage, and then there are a group of countries out there that are somewhere in the middle, and that perhaps if presented with indisputable evidence that something has been happening and affecting the safety of journalists, that they will in fact respond. So I think it does happen. I think Bolivia is one of our success stories from this last year, of where this report truly did play a key role in achieving action from the Bolivian government. With regards to your second question about next step for Voces del Sur and other countries where we hope to expand, so expansion is in the works. We have been fortunate enough to get funding from the U.S. Department of State to continue this for another couple of years. PADF, as one of the coordinators of the network, I think one of the strengths of the Voces del Sur network and of this report is, yes, we're including some of the countries with the most work to do in enhancing protections for journalists, the Nicaraguas, the Venezuelas of the world, but we also include countries like Argentina, and Uruguay that are some of the regional leaders in it. And so we have no particular ideological or any other prism that we're trying to prioritize. I think maintaining that diversity is a continued priority, but in reality, the decision of which countries to expand to will depend upon the interest of civil society organizations from those countries. So we will be doing an open process to recruit that next cohort of members and invite anyone here today or listening to participate that. Because the only limit is really the interest. It's a very there's a training process involved in terms of how to adopt the methodology, but once adopted, it really doesn't require much to make sure that alerts and reporting align with the SDGs and the rest of those sort of methodology.
Maybe to complete that answer, Adriana says that in Peru it has been adopted officially by the government. It has been taken in account. And also very important to say, in Bolivia, to being part. Before of that, they were just an organization that wasn't take really in account. So it's a way being a network of civil society organizations make this stronger, definitely. And in Venezuela, the experience gathered by IPIS, looking for all the monitoring and reporting on offline harassment, has helped to provide all the information for the online harassment right now. So there is all the reporting that's going on to have governments accountable right now with the different kind of intimidations.
Okay, questions from the audience? Anybody have something to raise with our distinguished panel?
Questions for the countries. There are we've got from Nicaragua, Venezuela, Ecuador,
Well, I
Bolivia.
can ask one other question because I was curious about the methodology. So when you say that the groups like Fundamedios and IPIS and others were, pooled their resources or consulted with each other, I guess was the proper term, to come up with the indicators that you added to the 3 that have already been accepted. How difficult was that process, and how did you go about it? Was this a lot of emails, or did you have meetings, and was there any disagreement about which ones to include and which ones to not include?
Yes, well, this actually was the most difficult process at all, because all the organizations in the different countries, they already were monitoring and reporting on abuses and alerts, but all of us had just different types of indicators we were taking account. So there were 2 different workshops where we sat down and worked on coming together for the different indicators. And the first thing, important thing, and was just to say, okay, we do have 5 indicators we need to report to SDG. That's very, very important. That we can't avoid them. Of course, when you say there is an assassination of a journalist, you say, okay, that's easy to write down. It's not always so easy. If you say, for example, a journalist was assassinated, okay, was he involved? Was he doing his job? Was this the normal crime? South America is not a safe place, not only for journalists, but for common citizens too. So what kind of crime was this? How do we differentiate this? Or was he being also bribing or being bribed? There are many things to consider. So being on the same page with the indicators wasn't easy. Then the next step was to say, okay, we do need also different indicators for every country. So we agreed on the next 8 indicators. And there was something very, very important, that is the gender-based indicator that crosses all the line. And but we are absolutely confident that we didn't report well on that. There were only 44 alerts on gender basis, and we're absolutely sure that this is underreported. In Bolivia, it's a huge problem what's happening with women journalists. It's also a problem in other countries, but in particular in Bolivia. So 44 alerts it's nothing. It was very interesting, and the way to
Just during that process to develop the indicators in those workshops and those consultations between all of the various organizations that are participating was everyone realized that developing these indicators helped improve everyone's understanding of their own environments, because as Dagmar was alluding to, sometimes it's hard to distinguish if a crime committed against a journalist was because of their journalistic work or just by luck, or classifying each of the abuses by the categories here has really helped each of the Voces del Sur members and also their national governments to understand what the true situation is in their country. That was kind of an unexpected result, something that emerged during those consultations.
Don, if you just permit me, also something very important that she's highlighting is that the mechanism has made possible that all the alerts from the regional level, from the provinces, the small provinces, those who are so apart from the capital, where normally all the protection mechanisms work well, they are also taking an account. They are also being considered. And also there is a follow-up of the cases. But it's not enough just to say, okay, we had so many journalists murdered, or these are kidnapped, or these are disappeared. Okay, what's happened a year after that? What's happened many months after that? And that's the most important part of this mechanism, to continue in the time.
Okay, you've had time to think about this now, so, all right. Well, first Mark and then Melissa.
I was just wondering, from your perspective, what you think about this process overall. I mean, we fought very hard from the media development community to get these indicators included in SDG 16, which is the one about the overall governance environment. And to have, for the first time, some media-focused kind of indicators on the agenda, on the international agenda, was a big deal. Now that it's happened, I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether you think this is really going to be successful. Is it going to draw more funding from donors into this sector? Is it going to actually pressure the laggard governments around the world to change their behaviors? I mean, how important do you think it is? Is it still, is the jury still out, or do you think that our hopes for this were well placed?
Well, we really expect this. This will really attract more funding. The most important thing is that this can continue in time. Just to make one report for 1 year, that will be really, really, really sad and a failure for civil society. So we really encourage, and that's probably one of the reasons we are sitting here today, because it's very important for all our organizations to count with more support. Doing this job it's not popular. It's not easy to do it. So, but the most expensive thing to do the methodology was already paid. Thank you, PADF. You are great on that. Now we have to hold it on time. And there are many organizations. There are organizations in the countries doing the job that we are doing. We need them to share it. We need them to include these indicators, because they can go on doing their job as they have been doing. It's only to say, okay, just check the box. What's happening with this guy? Well, check the box and check the following up.
I would say that there is an opportunity for all of those hopes to be realized, but it is far from a certainty, and it's going to rely on steady engagement from civil society, like the people in this room. On their own, I think the majority of the governments of the UN are not committed to or particularly interested in taking extra steps to extend protections for journalists or many of the other SDGs. You can see that reflected in the participation in the voluntary national reports and other such measures. But they are binding. They have binding commitments, and there's no, penal system for them or anything like that. But the commitments are there, and with the right pressure, I think they can be persuaded to cough up more time, energy, and resources. And if donors and governments are more aware of the process, I think they will realize that it's a really useful mechanism, a useful framework to use. It's been striking to me how little awareness of this process there is, even within diplomatic missions to the UN. And so the time is now to do it. But again, because I think because there are few actors there, those that are there have an opportunity to really make some noise and to draw some interest in a way that could have a lot of results.
I think, well, one of the most important things is what she also said on her speech is that society engages with this and take care of freedom of expression. If freedom of expression is not appreciated by society, if the citizens don't take care of that, and it's happened everywhere, we are also somewhere where freedom of expression is under threat. This mechanism or these reports don't have value. So it's very important citizens to support it.
Melissa, you had a question. Please identify yourself, and then Fabiola.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Melissa Cabrera from the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, or La Relatoría Especial de la OEA, also known as that. Well, my comments regarding two things. First, indicators, and then like the importance of all this process you have been talking about. First, and it's like a quick question because you've talked about how this indicator of how are we defining what is an assassination, if it was directly related to the person exercising journalism or not. And I wanted to know, like, how did you define it? Because in the office, like, we work on that also, so we really, well, it's like a decision you mainly have to take. And well, then just to talk to everyone about how this process is on the other side, like on the state part, UNESCO has been leading a lot of meetings and workshops in different parts of the region and of the world. And with states, it's really similar, like the discussion on what, like how to report on it. First of all, there are different institutions and they all report differently, like Fiscalías report differently what the Ministry of Human Rights does, or from the Ombudsman Office reporting. So even inside the states, there are different like numbers. So that's like a big issue. And then we've found like we have been encountered with comments from officers from states saying like, well, but if the state wasn't directly responsible of the assassination of a journalist, like if we didn't kill him or her, that does count? Like, is that a killing? You know, like that basic understanding of what is the state, what are the state's obligations in this regard. So I think that advancing, in this sense, in advancing and pushing states on their obligation to be accountable for the protection of journalists is key. Last week, we saw at the UN level, and you can tell us more if you were like following in more detail, but since there are so many indicators, states just are not reporting on this precise indicator because it's an uncomfortable indicator. It's better just to report on, well, how we, it's very good, but they're like basically reporting on the loss and access to information. That was a big advance, but we're talking about like 4-year-old or 5-year-old or 10-year-old loss. So pushing this topic forward, pushing this particular indicator forward, I think it's key. And if it's coming from chatter reports and from, well, like from putting the topic in the media, now UK, this huge conference to put this topic, to push it forward, I think it should be encouraged to continue like this kind of efforts, this kind of reports going to UN, so that countries can also commit to indicators and to reliable data, so we can work upon that, and so they can have a baseline to improve indicator and freedom of expression. And yeah, so the question was, yes, a comment, what else, so you can
Standardization of the indicators
comment
across-
more on how this works.
Maybe we take Fabiola's question next.
Gracias. Fabiola Cordova from the National Endowment for Democracy. It's a good segue, because I was thinking that the indicators that you develop are responding to, or the index you created are responding to the indicators, the UN indicators, but obviously this has many uses, right? And I'm kind of wondering how this information is being used by other international organizations, like the Relatoria, but also, I don't know, IFEX and others. So how are you making the most out of this comparative database to ensure that others are also using this information?
¿Cómo le vamos a sacar provecho a esta información? Regarding the definition of journalist, we, after great discussions, because among the members of Voces del Sur are organizations that are like syndicates of journalists in the countries, and they formerly only considered journalists only those who were working in a formal or traditional media. But we decided to use for the report the definition that is taken by the Inter-American Commission, and that is journalists are those persons who are working on traditional media, digital media, and that publish on a regular way. There are also activists and bloggers included in this, human rights activists and bloggers included in this reporting. So that's to the question. And regarding what we are planning to do further, so I think there are lot of opportunities to go on with this report. I think presenting it in New York and here is the first step, and we have to think on it, and all the good ideas that can come, welcome.
So on the question of definition, something that I've recently learned from talking to the UN did something smart where the definition of 16.10.1 is exactly matches that of data collected and reported on by UNODC. UNODC is the UN agency that reports on crime data. So one of the reasons why it's a quite limited definition in terms of what are the violations to journalist security is exactly so that that information, just like we're feeding into the SDG, that SDG data also fits exactly with what UNODC reports. And my understanding is the UNODC data is a little bit more widely used and accepted by governments. There's a little bit less resistance on the part of governments to, it's just kind of already standardized. And so that kind of addresses a few, but to Melissa, to your question about how everything is defined, again, that it doesn't get to the question of whether a crime was committed because of a journalist activity or not, but it does get to the question of whether it's committed by the government or somebody else. Either way, it goes into our data there. Fabiola, as to the information sharing, so this is our first full year's report, so we're working on all that. Melissa herself and Edison and the whole office has been a tremendous ally throughout this effort in helping us develop and disseminating the results. You know, we're doing everything we can at the UN agency, and we coordinate pretty closely with Article 19 and CPJ. We spent a good amount of time with them in New York this week, so we're doing what we can. Coordination is always a challenge, but certainly the idea is for this information to be shared as broadly as possible, and also for this to be just some proprietary initiative limited to the current members. PADF helped found and start this, but this isn't PADF's network any more than it's Fundamedios' network or EPC's network, and so we're definitely open to anyone who wants to engage in whatever way they do. You know, that is the goal of this initiative.
Frank?
Thank you. This is more a comment than
Frank,
than a
identify
question.
yourself for people who may not know you, although I think everybody does.
Sorry. Frank LaRue, now working with Dagmar in the Fundamedios office of Washington, D.C. One of the interesting debates that has always existed, and especially when I was rapporteur in the UN, was the question of how do you define the journalist? And then how do you define which violation should be accounted? And finally, how do you define whether the violation occurred because of doing journalistic work or was just common crime. And I think Matt already said that on what types of violations, a little bit has been taking the standards of ODC and also of the High Commissioner's Office. The question of disappearances, torture, are definitions that already existed within the UN system, and the way how to classify them by ODC. So the types of violations were already there. The more serious question is the definition of journalists, and I think here's where from Latin America there's a contribution, because in general we talk about journalists, periodistas y comunicadores sociales, journalists and social communicators, because obviously there's different forms of journalism. I mean, you can be a journalist in the community radio as well as you can be a journalist if you're a systematic blogger and if you do it systematically. But the more difficult question is whether there is a definition of when a violation occurs because of the task of investigative journalism or journalism itself. I remember that when Catalina Botero and I went to Mexico and the mechanism was created, I did a follow-up visit and spoke to the special prosecutor that had been created on violence against journalists. And she told me that they had 90 cases, and I said, and how many have you investigated? And she says, none yet, because we have not been able to prove that those 90 cases were linked to the profession of journalism or to the task of journalism. And I said, aren't you trying to put the cart before the horses? Because how can you know that before doing the investigation? It makes much more sense to investigate first and then come to that conclusion. So the big sort of recommendation that we had in those days, and I think is still valid, and we have discussed it with Edison and Melissa as well, is that all actions, all violent actions against journalists should be initially taken as being derived from their task of journalists, and then therefore should be investigated, and let the investigation prove whether that was the case or not. Maybe at the end it turns out that it was common crime. But if you don't have an investigation, that doesn't make sense to even have a discussion on that matter. And it's much more important to protect journalism than to just sort of reject the investigation of cases. So it was very important as a definition to keep on pushing that. Every single issue of violence against journalists, whatever type of journalism it is, should be investigated.
An excellent point. The reaction to that, or should we? Speaks for itself, Frank. Anyone else have a question? Okay, so Dan, and then lady over here.
Hi, I'm Dan O'Malley from the Center for National Media Assistance. And thank you. It's been really great hearing about this network, Voces del Sur. And my question is really a pretty simple one. You've done a great job on these 8 countries. Is there any talk of expanding to more countries? There's some large outliers in the region, and just wondering if, with the success of this report this year, if you anticipate more organizations joining your coalition.
So yes, there will be more added. Everything is always, the restriction, the limitation is often funding. So we do have funding to continue and to expand. I think we expect we're 8 now. We'll probably be able to add another 3 or 4 in the next year or so. As I mentioned before, we have no particular preference about which country that may be. There's obviously some holes in the map. Mexico, I think, is an obvious example where this sort of monitoring is necessary. Article 19 does a lot of great monitoring there, but incorporating them or doing something there certainly would be a wonderful priority for Voces del Sur. But the goal is to reach more and more countries rather than any particular country, is what I'd say at this point. And again, on behalf of all the partners here, invite anyone in this room who's interested, such as SEMA, such as NED, to at a pretty low cost, you can add another country. Again, with or without the participation of any one of us, it's pretty easy to add someone now that we're up and running.
Maybe just to add to that, actually, as I said before, it's we would need funding for doing this to add more organizations and countries. We in Fundamedios, based in our office in Washington, one of our mission is to try to get support and get people to know what we are doing there, to know, okay, this is a methodology that comes from bottom up, and we're doing something from the south, north, from the global south, take knowledge of it, and well, we would really expect those who can have the leverage to join this network and make it bigger to do it.
So Matt, does your funding that comes from the Department of State through PADF, when it goes to these partners, is it specifically project oriented for producing this data, or is it in any way core funding, or are you at liberty to talk about how that mechanism works?
Sure.
I'm just interested as a
Yeah.
member of a fund.
Of course. So the funding is priority one. The report itself is a product of the methodology. Priority one is the monitoring. There's a strong advocacy component to this initiative, both at the national and international level. So we talked a little bit about today. The emphasis was talking about the SDG process because that's what's going on right now. But as we've mentioned in the case of Bolivia and Peru, there have been some really great results at the national level. There's also a component of, it kind of depends on a country-by-country basis how each organization does its monitoring. In some cases, the partners do all of the monitoring themselves. In other cases, that monitoring is itself the result of a network of monitors. And so in those cases, there's a little bit of a capacity building component required. In the case of core funding, I wish I could say we were more generous. It's honestly pretty restricted. Again, that's because of PADF's donors. I don't know if you have anything, but yeah. So that's something we'd like to be able to do more. But to be honest, it's not a big part of what we're able to do.
There was a question over on this side of the room.
Katie Taylor, Pan American Development Foundation. Full disclosure, I work with Matt. I have a question as to whether it sounds as if this is a global best practice, given how new or early we are in some of the SDG processes. Do we know what other regions are doing? Thanks.
I'll take a first stab, and you two can elaborate. So yes, I think we'll be a Megan Rapinoe and try to take credit for our own success here and say I think it is a global best practice. That's why we're here today to celebrate it. I think we believe that for a number of reasons, but I think good evidence is actually last night there was a side event as part of the UN High-Level Political Forum organized by UNESCO at the United Nations in New York. A Voces del Sur member participated in that panel representing Latin America, and through that, and there were 4 panelists representing different parts of the world, and so through that and through the discussions that we've all had in New York over these past couple of weeks, I think we've come to understand pretty well what the situation is in other regions. I think only Europe can compare to the systematic regional monitoring that we are doing in Latin America. In Europe, there is a network, and they work with the Council of Europe in a really interesting and innovative way. But other regions of the world, if they're, I think Article 19 is taking the lead in coordinating that. I know Melissa has a lot of information about that as well, if you're interested in following up. In other parts of the world, if such regional monitoring and engagement is happening, it didn't reach this high-level political review, and it doesn't seem to be contributing to the SDG review so much.
No. I don't know if there are the people from the other organizations from the other countries. I don't know if
Yes,
you would like to ask them
members
something,
of
and
the
maybe we
network.
can translate for them, or
Any of the members of the Voces del Sur network who are here who would like to add their thoughts, please let us know. We'll give you a microphone.
no. Okay.
Okay, so any other questions or comments, remarks, complaints? No? Okay, well, if you would like to make any closing remarks, then we'll just end a little early.
Just to thank everyone for being here and say again that we have copies of our report outside on the table there, and heeding Fabiola's advice, again, the idea is that this data be as public and collaborative as possible. So anyone who is interested in, receiving the results on a more systematic level, engaging in any way in the future, that's what we're here for.
Yes, and well, thank you so much for challenging the heat. This is a really the heat in the summer, and we really appreciate you that you have all come to put attention to this. And we really would encourage you to share it with other colleagues, with other people, with other members of the community of freedom of expression and human rights. Maybe after summer, so you can share it with all your friends later. But we will appreciate that this to be known by as many people as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your participation. Well, brave the heat again.